welcome to this PCD webinar on families under attack. We've got a terrific panel of three speakers who are going to come to in a second. As always with PCD content, we've got our PCD members with us on our Zoom webinar, and also we've got a broader audience on YouTube. Questions are welcome from both of our audiences. It's great to have such an international mix of people joining this call. We are going to present to you a case study shortly involving all the elements of our speakers' expertise. We look forward to using that as a vehicle to discuss some of the key points. As always, as we move through, do put your questions and comments and thoughts in the chat, and I'll bring them on live to our speakers as we move through. So hope you're looking forward to the hour ahead. And right now, I'm going to come to each of our speakers for a quick introduction and a bit of positioning for this discussion today. So first of all, coming to Tom Rudkin from Farris. Good afternoon, Tom.
Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. So as David says, my name's Tom Rudkin. I'm a reputation management lawyer at Farris & Co in London. And to summarize what we do briefly, we help clients on all the legal issues that pertain to their reputation, their privacy, their security. And that can range from anything from helping clients in respect of mainstream media inquiries, assisting them with their online reputation, helping them with things like the Pandora Papers that we're going to come on to shortly, and also anything in between. And one of the things we'll touch on today is clients who find themselves on due diligence database like WorldCheck. That's a big area in the private wealth sphere and something we work on frequently.
Thank you, Tom. You must have seen this practice area evolve at a pace from when your other partners, older partners in the practice must have seen a very different business to the one that you've now developed your skills in.
Absolutely. And it's something I always say. When I started out 10 years ago doing this, the vast majority of the work would be helping clients in response to mainstream media, so traditional media. And as digital has become so much more prominent, and as social media has become so much more of a vehicle for damage to reputation, so the nature of our work has changed hugely. And the proportion of work that involves dealing with the Sunday Times or the BBC, it's still a big part of what we do, and it's bread and butter, but it's by no means, I'd say, the majority, or certainly not the vast majority like it was.
Great, certainly exciting area. I'd like to bring in Peter Hedden from Farrant Group. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you on this call. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name's Peter Hedden. I'm the co-founder and managing director of Farrant Group, a strategic communications consultancy. So we work with private clients across the globe, helping them manage their reputation on a range of issues.
Okay, terrific. And again, a very in-demand, fast-paced area that has shifted and pivoted over years.
I think so. Look, reputation has always mattered, but I think now, for many of the reasons we'll discuss on today's call, it matters more than ever.
Terrific. And last but not least, Jamie Barter from Harrod Associates. Good afternoon, Jamie.
Good afternoon again. Thank you for having me. I work for a company called Harrod Associates based here in London. That's not to say that we are UK-centric. We are global, and we are a traditional investigation company that really uses top-of-the-range investigative platforms and software to be able to help us support private clients, both in privacy and security, disputes in any form, but also that wider reputational issue, namely with a focus on our social media intelligence service.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to start the conversation off today. We're going to look at a case study in a moment, but I think as a backdrop, it's important to just discuss Pandora Papers, and it's the latest leak in a number of leaks over recent years that have been in the papers recently. Perhaps I could start with you, Peter, as to what's the significance of Pandora Papers? What do you think it means for high net worth clients?
Thanks, David. I think the significance of the Pandora Papers, obviously incredibly topical at the moment, is what it tells us about how the media works and how private clients can manage the media when an issue like this arises. We've advised a number of clients around this topic over the last few weeks, and most, if not all, of our clients or others that have been named have not actually done anything wrong. They've not committed any criminal wrongdoing, but that hasn't stopped the media from going after them. And why is that? I think it feeds into the overall media narrative around us versus them. Anyone who has money is guilty of wrongdoing. But I think it's worth looking at the sources of where this is coming from. And if you think about the ICIJ, it's primarily a left-wing organization. Nothing wrong with that, of course, on its own, but it has an agenda. And we have to be very open about that. At the same time, the media understand what makes a news hook and what doesn't. So the intricacies, the nuances of the story are little understood by the general public. And that's why you've seen, for example, in the UK, for example, the main hook around this story has been stories around donors to the Conservative Party at the time when the Conservative Party was holding its annual conference. So if you look at someone like Mohammed Amersi, who was the #1 story on the BBC site, if not globally, on that Monday morning, most people had never heard of Mohammed Amersi. But he was dragged in because of the connection with the Conservative Party and the question around donors. What I would say is that I think the impact of the stories have diminished quite quickly. I think they've lacked impact, and I think exposure was broadly limited for not just our clients, but most of the individuals involved. Boris Johnson has continued his career as a lucky politician in the sense that throughout the conference, fuel prices and gas prices and the lack of fuel was the bigger story. So there's some luck perhaps there. What I would say in terms of how do you manage it from a communications perspective, it's got to be the combination of the carrot and the stick, if you like. The carrot being working with a firm like us to help manage the communications with the media. The stick being how do you come at it from a legal point of view, which I'll let Tom talk about. But that's been our broad learnings from it.
Many thanks. And Tom, just coming to you then, building on Peter's points, what's your reflection perspective on the...
Well, I share Peter's view that actually, compared with some of the other disclosures, these have lacked a bit of impact, and they've been pushed very hard by both the BBC and the Guardian here, but not to no avail, but to probably less avail, I think, than they were hoping. I think from a legal perspective, there are probably two main angles to consider. One is the way in which this information was leaked, and it's almost certain that there was some element of criminality in the way the information originally found itself leaving the organisations whose data has been leaked. Now, that unsurprisingly is lost in some of the media coverage. There's no reflection on the behaviour of those who have probably acted criminally to disclose the information, and there is a reluctance on the part of the service providers to pursue that. And I think that's for two reasons. One, there's the risk of further adverse publicity if you're seen to try and cover up this stuff. And two, and Jamie will, I suspect, come onto this, it's very difficult to identify who's behind the leaks. The other perspective is obviously the individual clients whose information finds its way into the press. And like Peter, we've done a lot of work for clients affected not only by this set of disclosures, but also the previous ones such as Panama and Paradise. I think two things to take from that. One, the argument around confidentiality is one that we don't tend to run very often. The press will argue very strongly that there's a public interest, and the risk, rather like with the service providers, is that you end up being seen to cover up. So you're left with focusing on the accuracy of the story and whether it's defamatory. And that's how we've tended to approach this, to try and undermine the facts that form the basis of the story. One anecdote before I hand over to Jamie. The Blairs found themselves in the firing line for a property purchase where they purchased the company rather than the property. We had another well-known client, just not quite as well-known as the Blairs, who had almost exactly the same set of facts, and surprise, surprise, they didn't find their way into the Guardian. So interesting insight into how the media works.
Thank you. Jamie, what's your perspective on all this?
I couldn't agree more. Who's the story here? Is it actually the underlying individuals, or is it the ICIJ wanting their time in the sun again? And just to put it in perspective, and I'll go on a bit further down the line of how our systems collaboratively work with both Peter and Tom in terms of supporting our clients. But we have APIs that are able to touch upon and gather the huge amounts of information that are out there from the previous leaks, whether it's the Mauritius leaks, the Paradise, or the Panama Papers. And our APIs of being able to extract that information has only really come further down the line once the news story hasn't become the news story again. And questions have to be sort of, I suppose, risen in the sense that, where, as Tom said, where is this information and how has this information been acquired? If it is ethical hacking, I'm sorry, that phrase in itself is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. But also, who's marking the paper? If there is this sort of advancement on that platform to want to have greater transparency, then who's marking the homework on their part? And it's all very well in having wonderful graphics on your website to put shell companies or various other offshore jurisdictions directed towards an underlying individual. But again, where is this information that is readily available to the wider public, if that is their intention to allow the wider world to have more transparency on high net worth individuals or of anyone of wealth? That's our take.
Thank you. And there's a comment here from Selwyn Dan Hassan's in Gibraltar. Thanks, Selwyn, for your comment. It's just saying, is it right if there's no evidence of wrongdoing that this is published? And, it doesn't seem like from any of the reporting there was any evidence of anything like a tax avoidance, anything particularly wrong. I mean, where does the responsibility lie for making sure that these leaks that are published have some merit? I mean, I don't know whether there's a right answer to that.
I think, again, from a communications perspective, the problem there is that if our media published stories that were based purely on criminal wrongdoing, we wouldn't have any newspapers.
Yeah.
And we're in an age where journalists are expected to publish 3, 4, if not more stories a day. That's going out instantly, and that's not necessarily a new thing. It's not a new insight, but it means that things that aren't stories become stories.
Well, thank you for that. We're going to get into our case study now, which I'm just going to pull up on screen and introduce, and then I'm going to bring in our speakers for comment. So we've got here the Shamimi family. The Shamimis are a prominent Emirati family with a multitude of interests across the globe. These include a major presence in the automotive industry, comprising ownership of a number of leading car brands and significant manufacturing capability. The family also has links to the highest levels of government in Dubai. Historically, the family have sought to manage all of their affairs through a small private office with minimal external assistance. So that's the backdrop. And now here we have a scenario which I'm gonna discuss, and then we're gonna come straight to the panel. So while the Shamimis are fiercely protective over privacy and reputation, they do have a significant profile, not least because of their role in the automotive industry, and recently have been subjected to a sustained period of criticism, scrutiny across multiple platforms. Much is centered on coverage in Hungarian media, in which it's alleged that the manufacturing plant outside Budapest, owned by the Shamimis, has been involved in financial irregularities and embezzlement. The story has been picked up by other Central Eastern European media sources and is circulating wildly via a number of anonymous accounts on social media. Similar accounts are also appear to be disseminating wholly unsubstantiated allegations of fraud against senior members of the family, as well as claims of extramarital affairs against Mr. Shamimi, the chairman of the family business. One of the automotive business's key manufacturing competitors has established links to its CEO with President Orban of Hungary. And since the allegations were published, the family has experienced a closure of 2 bank accounts with leading financial institutions, while several suppliers are threatening to terminate their contractual relationships. So just coming to you, Peter, first, on the communications piece, how would you see this setup and scenario, and how would you start to help pulling some thoughts together?
Well, this is a kind of classic case where the family faces a kind of perfect storm of financial, legal, personal issues, all exacerbated by an aggressive media. It's very real, and it happens all the time. To counter, I guess, and mitigate the reputational risks that are at play here, and there are a number of different ones which we'll come on to, they really need a strategic communications campaign or program. And what do we mean when we say strategic? Well, it has to, so much of what we do can't just be taken to be communications on its own. It has to work in concert with a legal strategy. It has to work in concert with the business intelligence experts, and you need the comms on top of that. So that's the first. I would say think about this holistically when you come to an issue such as this. The second thing to say is that there are some immediate risks here, and there are some more longer term risks. And you have to kind of prioritize your approach to them. And what I mean by that is there's a reactive response and there's a proactive response. On the immediate risks, and that's what I mean by the reactive issues, perhaps. Let me explain what I mean by that. there are a number of accusations going on here. There are accusations of fraud, there are accusations of infidelity, there are accusations of political corruption. How do we rebut those accusations? The first thing to say is there's no one size fits all. I wish there was. This would be a much easier job if there was. What we will always do is sit down with the lawyers, sit down with the client, sit down with the family office, sit down with the business intelligence experts, and really go through the strategy. And there are a number of ways you can go through that. So thinking about some of these accusations, the immediate risks around some of these accusations. Hungarian media, for example, how do you address those accusations? First of all, I think you need to ascertain, and this is probably where Jamie can come in, and I'm sure we'll speak to the sources of those attacks. We see it again and again where attacks are politically motivated. They may be brought by malicious competitors. So first of all, understand where the attacks are coming from. Secondly, you need to, of course, in some form or another, take on the accusations. Now, it's a given that in everything I say, when I say take on the accusations, shift the narrative, rebut the accusations, it has to be based on fact and on truth and on everything you're doing. So we would typically look to enact an on-the-ground program with Hungarian media. But at the same time, I think the client would want to think about how do we activate media in English language markets that have big washback into Hungary and influence on the ground in Hungary. Secondly, I think the client would want to think about the SEO strategy, search engine optimization. I think it's more than likely that these accusations will now be dominating Google and other search engines, and those pose a significant threat to, apart from anything else, the client's business objectives. There are a number of ways we can go about addressing SEO. The best way, frankly, is through an organic campaign of creating content. And by content, I mean thought leadership, talking about the business, talking about the positive impact of the business, talking about philanthropy, whatever it might be that the client wants to talk about.
Just Peter, on that, so it's not like about getting something taken down from Google. It's about creating, making your own narrative and letting that drive and dominate. Is that right?
Absolutely. The numbers of clients that come to us and say, we just want this taken down.
Yeah.
A huge amount. But there's two things to say there. One is that it's very, very hard to do. It's very expensive and it takes time. And also, frankly, David, it's not sustainable, because the moment that the next big negative piece of coverage comes, then that will just, take up first place again. The way that a client needs to do this is to think about positioning that raises them just above the radar. Now, a family such as the Shamimis and others will, for a number of understandable reasons, have probably been below the radar most of their lives. What we help them do is fashion a positioning program, which is around thought leadership and content, that positions them just above the radar on a number of highly targeted and effective topics that they can own, that's true to them as a business and as a family, which starts to really make an impact, not just in the media, but also, as I say, online, and start impacting that profile. And that's hugely important if you think about, and I'm sure Tom will come on to this, the use of platforms such as WorldCheck by the banks and other institutions that will be picking this coverage up. Frankly, they're not that sophisticated. And really, that I'll wrap up because I've been speaking for a while, but that brings me on to my second point, which was, over the longer term, once you've addressed the immediate reputational issues, probably through a combination of comms and legal, you need to think about a longer term positioning program. And clients get frightened about that because they think we're suggesting having them out there all singing, all dancing, up in lights. We're not. We're suggesting a very targeted, just above the radar campaign that helps the positioning.
Thank you. Because a zero profile strategy is not credible. Is that, I mean, not to draw you out further, but is that a fair summary? People have to be proactive. It's
not credible. And it's also the fact that if you don't have any narrative, someone else will create the narrative for you. We've seen this in the Pandora case. Someone will speak about what you are. And do you want to define that, or do you want to let your opponents do that?
Perfect. Thank you. Jamie, what's your take on this scenario and setup, and build on some of what Peter laid out there?
Yeah, totally agree. We working hand in glove with both Peter and Tom in cases like this the whole time. How would we approach it, and how would we help, both from the strategic communication side, but also the legal side? We're almost, in terms of how we approach it, is really activating and utilizing the capabilities and systems that we have to hand. Just as a means of quick background, most of my colleagues were ex-National Crime Agency individuals, to which we had a variety of very, very good tools available to us whilst in government, which we've been able to bring into the commercial world, which adhere to strict levels of legality and also its ethicalness in terms of how we harvest the information provided. All is open sourced. However, what these systems do, one is an investigations platform, one is a social media monitoring platform, is that we're able to technically do what a human can do over 1 million man hours, but doing it in a millionth of a second. So we're able to react in a way that is quite impossible for a human to be able to either compute or quantify in terms of a huge amount of information, chatter, noise that's out there, let alone in different languages and different jurisdictions. So the systems are language agnostic. They don't rely on a traditional ClearNet scraper. We aren't based our systems on Google Alerts. These are individual systems that are monitoring over 104 different social media platforms, from the most regular that we all know to social media platforms that are only relevant in Turkey, for instance, or have a bias towards the Nigerian market, to all forms of blogs and social commentary that add to the chatter. So firstly, we're able to essentially have sort of pre-warning intelligence to the particular family and experts such as Peter. So we're able to get ahead of the story in the respective market because of the language agnostic elements of it, and it's leaning on non-traditional outlets, shall we say, that would then be able to better inform the experts in the strategic communications side, i.e. Peter, to be able to then be ahead of the story. So there's that one element, which is to be proactive and get ahead of the story. And secondly, isolating and targeting those behind the campaign. So, and I won't talk too much on this because this is Tom's expertise, but we work a huge amount of times with Tom and his organization, his firm, shall I say, to which we are trying to get behind or ascertain who is behind legally the defamation that is directed towards the institution, family, or individual. And again, the systems which we have, particularly investigation systems, are incredibly good at being able to, again, pinpoint and be able to target lines of inquiry to which we've had a very successful rate of being able to ascertain who is behind these campaigns that can take quite nasty elements of either disinformation that's been circulated in the respective market or country, or leaked on a large scale in terms of traditional lines of media. And just to put that in perspective, here in the UK, we still have the longest prison sentence given for crimes caused for stress and harassment on the internet, and that was actually an individual targeting a private client, to which there was accusations of the most erroneous sort of activities and accusations you could ever accuse of an individual, to which we were able to pinpoint legally and then provide that information to the legal experts such as Tom to then be able to act upon, either in a civil or criminal case. And obviously bring Peter into the field as well in terms of how to manage that reputational element once we find who's behind that. And lastly, I'll just say this is not just restricted to the private client world in jurisdictions that you would normally think this would operate in. We see this in very much the blue chip community as well now. We've not been surprised by the amount of cases that we've even dealt with regards to direct competitors using any forms of disinformation on the digital platforms to be able to direct accusations or reviews that affect the reputation of not only the firm, but also maybe the family that ultimately owns that commercial entity, as per example here on the case study. But I'll shut up now.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Very, very, very helpful. Tom, what's in the legal toolkit here? And just build us on now from in this scenario.
Sure. So you've heard sort of the role of Jamie, which is the intelligence gathering that then informs the strategy. And Peter's described how you can be proactive and reactive in terms of the way you communicate. My role, I'm sort of the bad cop here, which is to come in and try and eliminate as much of this as possible using legal principles. And I think looking at this case study, there are really kind of 3 or 4 angles to approach. One is trying to get the information removed directly from media publications themselves. 2 is trying to eliminate the social media campaign. 3 is looking, and Peter's touched on this, looking at Google and using some of the legal rights to have some of that information removed rather than, and as Peter said, the expensive side, just search engine optimization, which is to try and get tech to remove information. And then 4, using Jamie's intelligence potentially to go after whoever might be behind the campaign and bring proceedings against them. And I'll just touch on each of those. In terms of the media publications, obviously in this case, and this is very typical where you have an international campaign being run, you've got publications in another jurisdiction, in this case, Hungary, and that may cause jurisdictional issues. For me, I'm an English lawyer. Now, I might be able to rely on some general principles if we're dealing with a reputable publication, explains to them why what's being said is false and defamatory and inaccurate. And there are some publications out there who will adhere to that. It may need to be passed on to local lawyers in the jurisdiction, but it really depends on how reputable the publications are. And if this is a kind of politically motivated campaign, it may be that some of the publications you're dealing with are not reputable, which can sort of pose challenges in terms of taking action directly against them. And so I'll come on to Google in a minute, but the next stage is to try and have the information removed from social media or have the accounts themselves blocked. And the platforms, big tech platforms, have become considerably more amenable to content removal requests in the last few years. And there are 2 main reasons for that. One is data protection laws or data privacy laws in the UK and EU have got broader and broader in terms of their territorial scope. And it's no longer really possible for those platforms to simply say that they rely on California law, freedom of expression trumps everything, and we're never even going to respond or engage with you. So you can get a lot more done directly with the platforms. And I think secondly, the other issue is, sorry, David.
You have large teams of people you can interact with. You've got contacts and you take them the right case where you go, this is wrong, and they sort it for you. Is that right? Or
well, they don't tend to like to give you a human being to engage with. They have forms that you'll use to upload your complaint, and then you're into a dialogue. And the bigger the platform, I think the better they are. So the likes of Facebook, Instagram, Google, which I'll touch on, are pretty good and pretty prompt at replying. There are others out there. Telegram would be one, the big Russian platform, who are very difficult to deal with. And they're so libertarian that they just don't even bother engaging sometimes. But with the big platforms, you can get a lot done. And there's obviously more and more political pressure on them to be accountable for what they do. Linked to that is Google. And again, I expect people on the call will have heard of this concept of the right to be forgotten. That's essentially a data protection right that again spans UK and EU, but can catch platforms outside the jurisdiction where they're established in an EU country or in the UK. And that can be very helpful to reduce the visibility of these kinds of publications. So even if you can't get the story itself removed by the newspaper in Hungary, you can go to Google and say, look, this is just a disinformation campaign. It's completely fabricated, using the intelligence Jamie's pulled together to show that. And Google are pretty amenable to those sorts of requests. So that can be a very effective legal tool in protecting the reputation of clients. And then I guess the final one is to take action against the individual. And the reason this is a case study that's quite closely linked to a matter that Jamie and I were both involved in. And it was a big corporate dispute. And we were acting for an individual who was targeted with these kinds of allegations. And we used the intelligence to identify the person who we thought was behind it. And whilst we couldn't quite pin it on them as a matter of law in terms of being able to prove it beyond reasonable doubt or even for a civil court, we could use that to apply pressure in settlement negotiations. So that was quite effective.
Please.
And then just to finish the last sentence around the closure of bank accounts. This is the WorldCheck point I mentioned a little earlier, and I know all three of us on the call have acted for a lot of clients who appear on WorldCheck database, which for those who don't know is a platform that a lot of financial institutions and other professional services firms use when onboarding clients. And the difficulty, and Peter touched on this earlier, is that the platforms like WorldCheck just pool information from the internet, and that there's a limited amount of quality control in terms of verifying what goes onto a person's profile on the database. So these kinds of allegations, if they found their way into a courtroom in Hungary, or potentially into a reputable publication, they might end up on WorldCheck. And what we're then brought in to do is engage directly with WorldCheck to have that information removed using data protection principles, defamation principles, and that can be really effective for the client, because that's actually one of the biggest issues they face is clogging up of their professional and personal interests with bank accounts and professional services firms that actually has really long-lasting damage.
Okay, thanks. And Jamie, just to come back to you on a point, I mean, Tom mentioned about the variation in different social media platforms and how open they are to actually correcting things such as this. And you've got like Telegram there as a bulk messaging type tool that could do significant damage. In terms of your data analysis, are there different levels of access you can get through your technology tools into these different platforms, some of which are impenetrable, some of which are very open and obvious? What do you, from the tech perspective, how do you crack these different networks?
It's a good question. There's a combination between a heavy reliance on the powerfulness of the technology platforms that we have, mixed with let's say the collective years of experience that our ex-government investigators have of directing those systems and lines of inquiries, and if you're hitting a dead end, to redirect them in terms of in pushing them in a different direction, shall we say. So therefore, human behavior and patterns are incredibly useful for us to be able to sort of interweave that within the intelligence platforms that we have. And a good example of that, and I know it's not related to this, is we're acting very well amongst certain sports in which racism has been directed towards, both from the fan base, but also just individuals that don't have anything better to do but to direct their forms of hatred towards prominent stars of that respective sport. And the big thing is that, of course, we all know within the national papers of whatever country that we're from, recognize that there is a necessity for social media platforms to take security in a greater importance in terms of accountability, whether that's a national identification card, etc., to register accounts. That's a different story. The reality is, if you want to use a VPN and you want to have a burner phone to which you register a non-public email through that VPN process, you are able to have an alias or a social media handle of which you can churn repeatedly. And it doesn't matter if Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Gab, whatever it may be, takes down your particular account. We know full well that 2 seconds later a new account will be operating. Now, the interesting thing about our approach is that we use the systems and the wise heads. It's almost like tracing paper. Is that 99.9% of all time, individuals, ringleaders of disinformation will replicate the networks that they have had previously, regardless if it's a different handle or not. So we're able to almost put on tracing paper known aliases that have different names, to which they're having the same network in terms of spousing out their forms of disinformation. And also, of default, we're able to narrow that down again and to make a very informed choice that individual is the individual that we've been targeting in the first place. We then wait for what all humans do, which is to have one element of a mistake, which everyone will always do, to which we will then pounce upon in conjunction with people like Tom, to be able then to serve both in criminal and civil cases. So that's typically how we approach it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for breaking that down. That was very, very interesting reply there. So we're gonna build on the case now. I'll just introduce it, and I'm going to come to Peter on the media strategy. So, as with many a crisis, this one is followed almost immediately by another. The Shamimi's internal head of communications has been sent an extensive list of questions by the Sunday Times newspaper in London. The questions allege aggressive tax avoidance by the family, with the journalist relying on the family's previous use of services of Mossack Fonseca. The journalist also draws on a post on Glassdoor, an employee review platform, in which Mr. Shamimi is accused of sexual harassment by someone purporting to be a former employee of the business. The newspaper claims to have spoken to the employee in question. The accusations and ongoing media interest, this is not the first time a UK newspaper has been in touch, are impacting on the family's current operations and are a serious cause for concern as the business pursues a major push of electronic vehicles in Europe. So, Peter, do you want to pick up the thread here as we develop the case?
Yeah, thanks, David. Again, this is something that happens all the time, and you'll see that particularly the publications at what they would probably think of themselves as at the more serious end of the spectrum, the investigative type reporters, they will give you time, not always a lot of time, but particularly in complex. The newspapers are incredibly worried about getting some complex matters wrong and finding people like Tom, coming after them. So again, this is when and Tom referenced it earlier. This approach, this carrot and stick approach, is one that we've found to be highly effective. And what I mean by that again is that it's a combination of strategic communications and legal, in the sense that the moment that these questions come in is the moment that you can either really mess up the story or you can get it right. And sometimes it's just damage limitation. There's going to be a story and it's not going to be great, but that's just the facts. But how do you mitigate the worst impacts of that story? In this case, we would, again, sit down with Tom and the client and other advisors to really get under the skin of the issues around tax, understand not only the questions that the Times in this case is asking, but really deep dive into the business. And that's sometimes difficult for families and private clients, because who wants to give their Stratcoms firm all that information? But it's incredibly necessary, because based on that information, we, again, in combination with Tom and Jamie, which I'll come on to, we'll be in a position to assess whether we want to come out with some form of statement, which is, and then is that a very robust rebuttal? Is it somewhere along the lines of a mea culpa, which I doubt, or is it somewhere in the middle? And that can only be born on the facts in hand. Before you get to that statement stage, it's very likely that we will have Tom firing off letters, suggesting that as he mentioned earlier on, that there are defamation principles at play here, effectively cease and desist. That often works. It sometimes doesn't, and usually in our experience, it's probably somewhere in the middle, where the real meat, which was completely false in the first place, you're onto something when the follow-up email from the journalist is not from the journalist, but the head of legal at the publication. So it's working with the legal team to think about the stick, if you like. In terms of the carrot, a lot of the time we will have relationships with these journalists. Now, one of the things I'll say to clients is that there was a time in comms where effectively firms like ours would sell themselves by saying we know all the journalists. It may or may not be true, but it does, to a degree, it doesn't matter that much anymore, because what a relationship with a journalist does is it gets you time to you maybe go for a coffee, lunch, explain the situation, talk to them. It doesn't mean that they're going to not cover the story. Journalists just don't work like that anymore. But as I say, where that is helpful is it allows us to, off the record, and again, we may come on to this, we have to be very careful about what's off the record and what's on the record, because a lot of the times when you think something is off the record, you'll then be reading about it the next day. We can have a very private conversation with some of these journalists to outline the situation. If that's happening in tandem with the legal process, that's often highly effective. And I would say that approach is as true to the issues of the sexual harassment issues as it is for the tax avoidance issues. Again, I mentioned this earlier, and I want to stress this again. There needs to be at the same time as we're dealing with these immediate issues, there needs to be, because it's likely that this won't go away overnight. It may do, but it's likely it probably won't. The client needs to also be thinking about the rebound from this, or the reset, and that again is around some form of profiling, some form of thought leadership. It may be around something that we would call third-party endorsement, where prominent third parties, in this case, for example, it may well be experts on the energy transition and the role of electric vehicles in the energy transition, are talking about that with reference to our client as an example of best practice, and they do that because it's good for their profile. It helps them put stories out in the media, and it's just an interesting story. So it's got to be, I guess my answer is, again, it's got to be a combination of the skills that we bring alongside Tom, and then and there is often a space for intelligence in terms of working out where these accusations are coming from, and that's where Jamie would come in.
Thanks. I mean, Tom, the legal and comms piece there, very interwoven. I mean, perhaps you have to add on what Peter's laid out there.
Yeah, and I completely agree with everything Peter said. It's really important to have the two working in tandem, and I think he also mentioned that it's key to get on top of the facts. And from my perspective, that is the first thing that has to happen. So to the extent the client is able to deliver the factual background that is either able to refute or contextualize the inquiry from the journalist, that makes my job a huge amount easier. And from there, it's about identifying what we think we might be able to stop appearing, what we think we can chip away at, and take that as far as we can go before Peter then, who's advising in the background, then decides what kind of statement might appear in the paper. So it really does have to be complementary working alongside each other to achieve the best result for the clients. I mean, looking at this set of facts, you've got the tax allegation is a very typical one, where the journalist has a sort of an overarching piece of information that the client previously worked with Mossack Fonseca, and is going to use that to make what could easily amount to a defamatory allegation of either tax avoidance, which isn't necessarily unlawful, but it could stray into an allegation of unlawful activity, which is certainly defamatory. And what I'd be looking to do here is try and undermine this sort of Mossack Fonseca plus client equals unlawful activity without an appreciation of the facts, which again is why that factual matrix becomes so important, because you can start to undermine the basis for that allegation. But I think on that one, it's going to be difficult to stop that story unless it's all completely untrue. It's going to be more about chipping away at what they can say and bringing it down to a level that's acceptable. The other allegation around sexual harassment is obviously a very serious personal claim about the patriarch of the family. And that's one that the newspaper's got to be very confident before it runs it. And an employee who's posted an anonymous review on a review platform, well, that's one source who they've got. Now, are they really going to be able to stand that up? Because if they publish that without justification, then potentially very serious reputational harm and serious consequences from a legal perspective, they're not able to stand it up either as being true or in the public interest. And I think that's the kind of allegation where if we had information that refuted that, for instance, the employee having an axe to grind and they were in a different place when this supposedly happened, then I feel quite optimistic about trying to stop that appearing in the paper. But again, it all depends on the facts. Peter mentioned on the record and off the record, our engagement, the lawyer's engagement, will tend to all be on what's called a not for publication basis. So we'll be writing letters that are not designed to appear in the newspaper. And whilst that's not a kind of hard and fast rule that the journalist has to follow, reputable publications will respect that. And ultimately, it's not really in their interest to put a lawyer's letter in their story because it threatens to undermine it. So that's how we tend to engage. And again, it can be very effective in either toning down a story or even stopping things appearing.
Okay, thanks for that. And Jamie, on the intelligence front with this new bits of information, what would you what would you be looking at?
Yeah, well, to take Glassdoor as an example, it's a bane of people's lives, particularly if they have multiple commercial entities, of which it's essentially it's the wild, wild west for any form of accusation without any form of accountability in theory. And I mentioned the behavioral analysis that we use in terms of our systems of being able to narrow down, but also being able to present facts in conjunction with teams like Tom, to present to entities such as Glassdoor and say, look, here are the facts. Here is enough to be able to force an injunction to which we will have to gain not only the email registered on that particular post, but also maybe even an IP address. And a real life story on this is that this actually happened numerous times, of which, again, we've been able to present with the legal team to Glassdoor, presenting them with the facts to which they've had to surrender this information due to the injunction. Now, that email might not even be an email in terms of my first name and last name @gmail.com. Again, it might be an anonymous email. However, human nature, again, makes mistakes. And the wonder of the system that we have is that that individual won't go and buy a burner phone and re-register a new email every time they do it. They've probably registered that to a platform which they don't want to receive spam from on their day-to-day lives. So we were actually, in conjunction with the systems of being able to use that new information to then get a positive idea of who the individual was, an address, a phone number to then serve notice, as well as using image recognition on one of the reviews which they did, to be able, again, to pinpoint who this individual was. And then at that point, it became a criminal matter due to the accusation, and the police were then involved. And again, the police love it because it's packaged and it's to an admissible level, steered by legal experts like Tom, to which they can then act upon it, rather than going as a rich individual to the police service, which, quite frankly, to no fault of their own, are underfunded, don't have enough time, and don't really have an understanding of all the resources available. And certainly, as an ultra high net worth coming to complain about a defamation issue, you're not at the front of the queue with major issues. We found, surprise, surprise.
That's understood. Tom, I guess with things like the sexual harassment claim, in the climate of Me Too, it must be a very delicate balance as to how the strategy is pursued, because a media splash could create more people coming forward, or it's a different landscape, I think, to where we were at. How have you seen that coming out in the way that people involved in some controversy set up their approach and their strategy in this difficult field?
It's a really good point, David, and I think often with these kinds of situation, it depends on the volume and specificity of the allegation. So and we've been doing something for an organization where one of their members was accused of this kind of behavior, and the volume of people coming forward just meant it was unsustainable. I mean, we weren't essentially on that person's side, but it would have been unsustainable for that individual to try and come out swinging haymakers and telling everyone to be quiet. I mean, that just wasn't going to work, and that's partly because of today's climate, but also it's just very difficult to do that unless you've got really specific evidence and he can undermine it. The problem is there's such a strong perceived public interest in exposing this kind of behavior that it can be difficult to stop it when you've got that high volume of complaints. In this scenario where you've only got one, I think you can be a bit more bullish, but it's a really difficult field, and there are examples of people who Cliff Richard probably being the best example, where he was thrown to the wolves by the BBC on the basis of a very historic allegation, and in that case actually it was about privacy, because he was the subject of a criminal investigation, and there've been all sorts of cases on privacy grounds around that. And that's a really interesting area as well, because you'd think, well, that kind of feels like defamation and harm to reputation, but actually there is there's a chain of cases which says that when someone is being investigated by the police, they have an expectation of privacy, and you're left in a slightly odd position where people under investigation have privacy rights, but the individual who's just accused of these things, and where accusers go to the newspaper, they don't have that same privacy right relating to a police investigation. So you can almost be in a better position as an individual if you're under investigation than prior to it. But I mean, look, it really does depend on the facts. And we have done cases for people who have had to front up and mea culpa. And that's where, again, Peter's expertise comes in terms of how do you navigate your way through that?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I completely agree with Tom. I mean, particularly around these types of issues and Me Too, but not solely these issues, you can win the legal case, but lose in to use the old cliche, lose in the court of public opinion. And that's why some element of a combination of the legal approach with the comms approach, where we're advising on, is it appropriate to put out a statement? If the statement goes out, what is the tone of that statement? How are we engaging media? I think it's really important.
Okay, great, thank you. We're just coming towards the end of this case study, but I'm just going to cover off some security risks. So to make matters worse, the Evening Standard has published details of the Shamimi's plans to build an underground swimming pool at their London home. Photography of the property is all over the internet. Jamie, what this kind of scenario, do you see it often, and what are some of the threats that can emerge from that?
Absolutely. The amount of information now, talking of tech, there's someone's calling through my computer. Let me just turn that off. So the most typical thing that we have directed towards this sort of issue is particularly high value residential property to which there is a digital I'm so sorry. Right. I'm trying to turn this off and it's not happening.
Great. I think we got it. Please
got it off. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The biggest problem that we have in this is actually the high value residential properties that have been sold have either prospectuses or floor plans that have been still available on the wider ClearNet in terms of when they were marketed to be then seen amongst the whole wider world. And then also in terms of development, it's not rocket science that there are certain parts of this, if we're making this UK centric, certain parts of the UK to which there are a high volume, shall we say, of high volume of individuals of wealth and influence, whether that's South Oxfordshire, London South East, you name it. And we know that a lot of publications, unfortunately, do consistently sit there and look at the new applications to high-end residential properties. So there are people that are in the sports media entertainment space that kick footballs, for instance, that there are tabloid papers that are looking at this consistently. And we have never been surprised at the amount of information that can be obtained in the open source world. And one client that we dealt with, the article that was featured in the paper was directed straight towards the planning application process, to which you could see to the millimeter the cameras and gatehouse and all the other new security mechanisms that were being placed in terms of its strategic position on the blueprints, all there for any would-be individual that wants to do that family a particular harm available to them. Gone are the days now where serious organized crime is doing all of their intelligence in a car sitting outside of the property. Globally, you can get Google satellites. You are able to obtain a huge amount of information related to the soft underbellies, namely with social media amongst the next generation as well. There's a famous court case here where there was a prominent individual to which had £400,000 worth of high value materials that were stolen. And when the judge was presented with the accused, again, they had forensics on the computer of a legacy of 3 years worth of backdated social media intelligence, to which the wife had captured digitally most of the rooms of the house with the actual property, high value assets, whether it was cars, watches, handbags, etc. And the gang was so clever that actually it recognized through means of inquiry who the house manager was, when the house manager was away on holiday, because they were equally following the house manager on Facebook, and saw that the principals were away on holiday because they had geotagged where they were on holiday, they had a free run of it. And we also have the ability to monitor photographs of the houses or keyword associations that are only specific to that residence and the particular family in question. Again, that enables us to give the heads up to both the legal team and the strat comms team to when red flags start to exist. So there's, in one way, the actual physical security threats are mitigated and approached head on, as well as having to then deal with who are these individuals that are targeting the family. Just look lastly quickly, because I know we're short of time. We do a huge amount of keyword associations also with the family, and sit down with the lawyers and say, right, what are the only words that are associated that are only within the internal realms of security within this ecosystem that extends to your house manager, chauffeur, and your kids. Some of our clients, they're up to 2,000 words plus, some are just mere shy of 50. And that can be the keypad to the front of your house, it can be the name of your lawyer, it can be the name of your pets, the car registration, the name of the Picasso in your back room. And we're monitoring that 24 hours a day in terms of invisible layer. And again, as a red flag process, being able to update their legal entities or the head of the family to say, look, this is mustering in certain forums, chat rooms. Do you want us to do a bit more digging? And then we can do enhanced due diligence on the individual. And then it's a question of whether that is presented to the police or whether actually the risk has been mitigated straight away.
Okay, thanks. And Tom, I mean, at Farrers, you've got great property teams doing big real estate transactions and development. Are you working more closely with colleagues now on some of these angles, which previously I think wouldn't have seemed as relevant in a pre-social media age? What are you finding?
Yeah, it's funny. I think in the last year we've done more property-related cases than we had in the previous 5, and it often arises either because information remains online after the purchase of a property, or it's a high-profile person, as Jamie said. And I think, and so we are speaking a lot more closely, both to our property teams and to people like buying agents who are advising these clients on the purchase. And I think the key thing really to draw out this slide is that identifying someone's home in a newspaper, or doing so even on a estate agent website, that you can jigsaw identify where a particular person lives because that home is also reported in the media, that engages their privacy rights. And we've done a lot of pieces of work trying to clear that information off for all the security reasons that Jamie has mentioned. And it just, the other thing is it's very easy to kind of reverse engineer photographs that appear in a newspaper. So there might be an estate agent's photo that's used in an article in the Daily Mail. You can then reverse search that on Google, and you'll be able to identify exactly where the property is located. And that's obviously a big concern for the client. So we're then brought in to essentially enforce the privacy rights that attach to that.
And one good collaboration story with that is a site called Virtual Globetrotting, which actually is very good when it's presented. Oh.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I just stopped the slides.
It's very good when presented with, again, the facts. But if you ever get bored and go on there, the lists of individuals in the prominent eye or particular countries where there is a famous businessman or individual, again, they will go down to the actual location on Earth, as well as the Google Maps location, to which you have a Google Map satellite image there, again, for the whole world to see. And that's just a platform that serves super fans and various other individuals that are slightly bored. But again, it can take that nefarious act very, very quickly, particularly when in this country we've seen a huge amount of rise in aggravated assaults amongst ultra high net worth individuals, unfortunately. But again, it's not selling that fear. It's about just mitigating the risks associated with the family that are available for the whole world to see, and just tidying those up.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us for this discussion today. We're out of time. I'm sure we could have carried on discussing all the facets of this discussion all afternoon, but I'm very grateful to you gentlemen for joining me today. And we look forward to sharing this further with our community and building this discussion as we go forward. So thanks for joining me today, and I wish you a good afternoon.